The winter wind swept across the empty plains of Montana Territory with a force that seemed determined to erase every trace of life. Snow drifted over the railroad tracks as the last evening train disappeared beyond the mountains, leaving behind only silence and a cloud of white steam that slowly faded into the darkening sky. Standing alone on the wooden platform was Clara Bennett, gripping the handle of her worn leather suitcase until her fingers ached from a cold. She watched the train vanish, convinced that someone would appear at any moment. The letter had promised that a representative from Pine Hollow would be waiting for her. It had described a warm boarding house, friendly townspeople, and a small school desperate for a teacher before the new year began. After months of mourning the death of her elderly aunt, the letter had felt like an answer to every prayer she had whispered in lonely nights. Clara had sold nearly everything she owned. The little furniture inherited from her family was gone. The tiny cottage she had rented was left behind. Every dollar she possessed had been spent on the long train journey west. She carried nothing except a suitcase filled with a few dresses, several school books, family photographs, and the hope that somewhere beyond the snow lay a place where she truly belonged. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. No wagon arrived. No horse appeared on the distant trail. No one called her name. The station grew painfully quiet. An elderly station master finally stepped outside, wrapping his heavy coat tighter around himself. "I'm sorry, miss," he said gently. "Are you waiting for someone?" Clara smiled nervously. "Someone from Pine Hollow School was supposed to meet me." The old man frowned. "Pine Hollow School?" "Yes." He studied the letter she handed him before slowly shaking his head. "I've lived here 20 years. I've never heard of any school by that name." For a moment, Clara thought he must be mistaken. "There has to be one," she whispered. "They offer me a teaching position." The station master sighed. "The address listed here belongs to an old church. It burned down years ago." Her heartbeat stumbled. "Burned down?" He nodded sadly. "Nobody has lived there since." The words struck harder than the icy wind. Clara stared at the paper, reading the same lines over and over as if they might somehow change. Every sentence that had filled her with hope suddenly looked like nothing more than ink on worthless paper. Someone had lied to her. Someone had wanted her to travel hundreds of miles for absolutely no reason. The station master looked genuinely sorry. "The next train won't come until the day after tomorrow. The weather's too dangerous tonight." He locked the office doors after giving Clara a small lantern. "I wish I could do more." When he disappeared into the snow, she was left completely alone. Darkness settled over the tiny depot. The wind slipped through cracks in the wooden walls, carrying flakes of snow inside the waiting room. Clara wrapped her thin coat tighter around herself, trying to ignore the cold creeping into her hands and feet. She wanted to cry, but she had already spent too many nights crying after losing everyone she loved. She refused to let another disappointment break her. Still, loneliness has a way of making even the strongest people question themselves. She wondered who could have written the letter. Why choose her? Why send her so far from home? Outside, the storm grew stronger. Several miles away, rancher Ethan Cole urged his horse along a narrow trail. He had spent the afternoon delivering medicine to an injured ranch hand who lived beyond the northern hills. The trip home had taken longer than expected, and now the blizzard threatened to swallow every landmark on the open prairie. Ethan had lived alone for nearly 6 years. His wife had died from illness. Their young son had followed only months later after a harsh winter fever. Since then, his ranch had become little more than a place to work, eat, and sleep. Most evenings he spoke only to his horses. As he approached the railroad crossing, something unusual caught his attention. A single lantern glowed inside the abandoned depot. He slowed his horse. Nobody should have been there, especially not during a storm like this. Curious, Ethan tied his horse outside and pushed open the creaking wooden door. The sight inside stopped him. A young woman sat alone on a bench, hugging a suitcase against her chest while trying desperately not to shiver. She looked exhausted, frightened, yet she lifted her chin with quiet dignity when she noticed him. Without saying a word, Ethan removed his heavy wool coat and placed it over her shoulders. "You'll freeze wearing that thin jacket," he said calmly. Clara looked at him with surprise. You don't even know me. Ethan gave a faint smile. I know enough. No one should be left alone out here. For the first time since stepping off the train, Clara felt the weight on her chest ease ever so slightly. She explained everything. The letter, the promised teaching job, the abandoned address, and the station master's warning. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finally handed him the letter, his expression changed almost instantly. His eyes narrowed. He looked again at the signature, then toward the dark window. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. It came 3 weeks ago. Ethan folded the paper slowly. I've seen handwriting like this before. Before Clara could ask what he meant, the sound of horses echoed through the storm. One horse, then another, then several more. The hoofbeats stopped outside the depot. A deep voice called through the howling wind. Clara Bennett. Her blood turned cold. I know you're inside. Ethan stepped toward the window and carefully looked through the frosted glass. Three armed riders stood beside their horses. Their faces were hidden beneath dark hats. He immediately understood one thing. They hadn't come to help. They had come because they knew exactly where Clara would be. Ethan didn't hesitate. He folded the letter, slipped it into his coat pocket, and quietly extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the waiting room, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the frosted windows. The voices outside grew louder. Search the building, one of the riders ordered. She couldn't have gone far. Ethan leaned close enough for Clara to hear his whisper. There's a storage door behind the freight room. She looked toward the entrance where heavy boots crunched through the snow. They'll find us. Only if we stay. Without waiting for another second, Ethan guided her through the narrow hallway behind the ticket office. At the rear of the depot stood a weathered wooden door half buried in snow. He pushed it open just enough for them to slip outside. The freezing wind hit them like a wall. Ethan untied his horse and helped Clara climb into the saddle. Hold on. What about you? I've ridden these trails my whole life. He swung up behind her just as the front door of the depot burst open. There they are. A gunshot echoed across the valley. The bullet struck the wooden fence only inches away. Ethan urged the horse forward. The animal leaped into the blizzard, disappearing among towering pine trees before the riders could organize a pursuit. For nearly an hour, they traveled through twisting forest paths hidden beneath fresh snow. Ethan never chose the obvious trail. Instead, he crossed frozen creeks, wound between thick stands of cedar, and doubled back whenever the wind erased their tracks. Only when the sounds of pursuit had completely disappeared did he slow the horse. Ahead stood an old trapper's cabin tucked against the side of a rocky hill. Its roof sagged beneath years of heavy snow, but the walls still stood firm. We'll be safe here until morning, Ethan said. Inside, dust covered nearly every surface. A cracked stone fireplace occupied one corner, while broken shelves lined the opposite wall. Despite its condition, it offered shelter from the relentless storm. Ethan quickly gathered dry firewood stored beneath the porch. Soon bright flames filled the cabin with warmth. Clara stretched her frozen hands toward the fire. I thought I was going to die back there. You won't, Ethan replied quietly. As long as I'm with you. Those simple words carried more comfort than she expected. For the first time since leaving home, she felt she wasn't completely alone. While Ethan melted snow for drinking water, Clara placed her suitcase beside the fireplace to dry. As she lifted it onto an old table, something strange happened. A loud crack echoed through the room. The leather lining inside the suitcase suddenly split open. Clara stared in confusion. I've packed this suitcase for years. I never noticed that. Ethan walked over. Carefully reaching inside the torn lining, he pulled out a small brass compass wrapped in faded cloth. The metal was badly tarnished with age. An unusual symbol had been carved into its cover, a tall pine tree surrounded by a circle of tiny stars. Clara frowned. I've never seen this before. It couldn't have belonged to me. Ethan examined it closely. It looks old, very old. When he pressed a tiny latch near the hinge, the compass unexpectedly opened into two separate compartments. Hidden beneath the needle rested a tightly folded piece of yellowed paper. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, steady, and unmistakably familiar. She had seen those letters before. "My grandfather," she whispered. "He used to write birthday cards exactly like this." The note contained only one sentence. "If fate ever brings you to Pine Hollow, follow the river before trusting a single soul." There was no signature, only the same carved pine tree symbol. Clara looked up in disbelief. "My grandfather died when I was 12. I never even knew he had been here." Ethan became unusually quiet. "I've heard stories about him." "You have?" He nodded slowly. "People used to say Arthur Bennett helped build several settlements across this territory. But one day he disappeared. The official story claimed he stole money from local families before running away." Clara immediately shook her head. "That's impossible. He wasn't that kind of man." "I know," Ethan answered. "My father never believed those rumors either. He always said honest people usually disappear because dishonest men need them gone." Silence filled the cabin. The fire crackled softly while the storm continued outside. If the note was genuine, then Clara's grandfather had expected someone in the future to find it, which meant he had hidden it deliberately. But why? Ethan carefully inspected the brass compass again. There has to be more. Running his fingers around its edge, he noticed another tiny latch hidden beneath years of rust. When he pressed it, a secret compartment slid open. Inside lay a faded strip of cloth with several hand-drawn lines that resembled part of a map. A winding river, a mountain ridge, and a large pine tree marked with a dark X. Neither of them recognized the place. "It isn't complete," Ethan said. "It's only one piece." Clara folded the map carefully. "My grandfather wanted someone to find this. But for what reason?" Before Ethan could answer, a distant sound drifted through the night. Horse bells, then barking dogs. He immediately stood. "They're searching again." Clara moved toward the tiny window. Far across the valley, dozens of lanterns flickered between the trees. There were far more riders than before. "They've brought half the county," she whispered. Ethan's expression hardened. "No, they've brought men who are being paid." As they watched from the darkness, one rider separated from the group and nailed a large poster onto a wooden sign near the crossroads. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized what it was. A reward notice. Someone had placed a bounty on both of them. By sunrise, every bounty hunter, drifter, and hired gun in Montana Territory would be looking for Clara Bennett and the rancher who had chosen to protect her. And somewhere beyond the forest, the man who had written the false letter smiled, knowing the hunt had only just begun. The first light of dawn barely reached the forest as Ethan and Clara slipped away from the abandoned cabin. Neither of them had slept. Every distant howl of the wind sounded like approaching riders, and every creak of the old walls reminded them that the bounty hunters were still searching. Ethan tightened the saddle on his horse before looking at the faded map hidden inside the brass compass. "The river begins about 3 miles east of here," he said. "If your grandfather left us a trail, that's where we'll find the next clue." Clara nodded, carefully tucking the compass beneath her coat. "It feels strange." "What does?" "Yesterday, I believed I was traveling west to become a schoolteacher." She managed a weak smile. "Now I'm chasing secrets I never knew existed." Ethan climbed into the saddle. "Sometimes the truth finds us long before we're ready for it." They followed the frozen river as it twisted between towering cliffs. The water had hardened into thick sheets of ice, reflecting the pale winter sun like polished glass. Hours passed without seeing another soul, but Ethan remained alert. Every few minutes, he stopped to study the snow, making sure nobody was following. By midday, they reached the place marked on the map. A massive pine tree stood alone beside the river, its branches bending under the weight of fresh snow. "This is it," Clara whispered. Ethan searched around its roots until his boot struck something solid beneath the snow. It wasn't a rock. Together they uncovered an old iron ring attached to a wooden trapdoor hidden beneath layers of frozen earth. Ethan pulled with all his strength. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Clara looked at him nervously. My grandfather built this? I don't know, but someone wanted it to stay hidden. Ethan lit an old lantern from his saddlebag, and they slowly climbed underground. The passage led into a network of forgotten mining tunnels abandoned decades earlier. Wooden support beams stretched overhead, while rusty rails disappeared into the darkness. Dust covered everything, untouched for years. The silence felt almost unnatural. After several minutes, they entered a large chamber. Old crates were stacked against one wall. Broken mining tools lay scattered across the floor. In the center stood a heavy wooden desk covered with thick layers of dust. Clara brushed away the dirt. Instead of gold or money, she found bundles of carefully wrapped papers tied together with faded blue ribbon. She untied the first bundle. Her eyes widened. These aren't personal letters. Ethan looked over her shoulder. They're contracts. Dozens of land agreements. Property records. Maps. Receipts. Official government documents. Every page carried signatures from families who had settled Pine Hollow nearly 30 years earlier. But something wasn't right. The same name appeared again and again beside every transaction. Silas Crow. Clara continued reading. Many settlers had supposedly sold their land for almost nothing. Others had signed agreements they couldn't even read. One document caught Ethan's attention. A handwritten statement from Clara's grandfather. I, Arthur Bennett, declare these ownership papers to be fraudulent. The settlers have been deceived, and the land has been stolen through forged contracts. Beneath the statement were dozens of signatures from witnesses. Clara's breathing became shallow. My grandfather wasn't hiding treasure. He was protecting evidence. Ethan slowly nodded. He discovered the truth. He tried to expose them, and someone stopped him before he could. Everything suddenly made sense. The false accusations, his disappearance, the mysterious letter. Someone had spent decades making sure Arthur Bennett's name was remembered as a criminal instead of a hero. Because as long as everyone believed the lie, nobody would ever question who truly owned Pine Hollow. Clara carefully gathered the documents. We have to take these to the sheriff. Ethan's expression remained serious. I wish it were that simple. What do you mean? The sheriff was appointed by men who owe everything to Silas Crow. Clara's heart sank. So we can't trust anyone. Not everyone. But we need to choose carefully. Just then, a voice echoed through the tunnel. You won't be taking those papers anywhere. Ethan spun around, raising his rifle. A familiar figure stepped into the lantern light. Jacob Turner. Ethan stared in disbelief. Jacob had been his closest friend for nearly 15 years. They had worked neighboring ranches, shared meals, helped each other through droughts and blizzards. You? Ethan asked quietly. Jacob couldn't meet his eyes. I'm sorry. I never wanted it to happen this way. Several armed men emerged behind him. Silas Crow stepped forward wearing a long black coat dusted with snow. He smiled as though greeting old friends. I've spent a very long time searching for those documents. His eyes settled on Clara. And now you've delivered them to me. Clara held the papers tighter. You murdered my grandfather. Silas chuckled. I didn't murder anyone. I simply protected the future of this valley. You built your fortune on stolen land, she replied. And lies. His smile vanished. History is written by those who survive. The outlaws surrounded them from every direction. Ethan quietly lowered his rifle. There were too many. Jacob stepped closer, shame written across his face. They offered money. My ranch was failing. I didn't know they'd hunt an innocent woman. Ethan looked at him with deep disappointment. I would have helped you. Jacob lowered his head. I know. Silas extended his hand. The papers. Clara refused. Instead, she slipped the bundle beneath her coat. You'll never have them. Silas sighed impatiently. Tie up the rancher. His men rushed forward. Ethan fought with everything he had, throwing one outlaw into the wooden supports before striking another with the butt of his rifle. The narrow chamber erupted into chaos, but numbers eventually overwhelmed him. His rifle was kicked away. His hands were bound tightly behind his back. Clara tried to escape through another tunnel, but two men caught her before she reached the stairs. Silas walked toward her slowly. You have your grandfather's courage." He smiled coldly. "Let's see how long it lasts." As the outlaws gathered the documents and prepared to leave the underground chamber, neither Ethan nor Clara noticed one small page slipping unnoticed beneath the dusty wooden desk. The single forgotten document remained hidden in the darkness, waiting for someone else to discover the truth before it was too late. Silas Crow smiled with quiet satisfaction as his men forced Ethan and Clara out of the underground chamber. Snow swirled through the mountain pass while the outlaws loaded the bundles of documents onto a pack horse. Their rifles remained trained on the prisoners, leaving little hope of escape. "You should have stayed on your ranch," Silas said, adjusting his gloves. "Instead, you chose to become part of a story that should have ended 30 years ago." Ethan remained silent. He knew arguing would accomplish nothing. Clara glanced toward the steep mountainside. She noticed fresh snow hanging loosely above the cliffs. One loud disturbance could easily send it crashing into the valley. Silas ordered 2 men to tie Ethan beside an old pine tree, while another searched Clara for anything she might still be hiding. The outlaw removed the brass compass from her coat and handed it to Silas. He laughed. "So this little trinket caused all this trouble." Without thinking, he tossed the compass onto the frozen ground. The lid sprang open. A tiny folded paper slipped from a hidden compartment no one had discovered before. Everyone froze. Silas snatched it first. His confident smile slowly disappeared as he unfolded the fragile page. Unlike the other documents, this was a signed confession. Years earlier, Silas's own father had admitted forcing settlers to surrender their land through threats and forged contracts. At the bottom of the page were the signatures of 2 respected judges who had agreed to reopen the investigation before mysteriously disappearing. Silas crushed the paper in his fist. No one was ever supposed to see this. Clara looked straight into his eyes. The truth always finds its way into the light. Silas's patience finally vanished. "Enough." He raised his revolver. "I've spent my entire life protecting my family's legacy. I'm not losing everything because of one schoolteacher." Just before he pulled the trigger, a loud crack echoed across the mountains. Everyone instinctively looked upward. The unstable snowpack shifted. Chunks of ice rolled down the slope. Ethan shouted, "Run!" A small avalanche thundered across the hillside, crashing between the prisoners and the outlaws. Horses panicked, ropes snapped, and men scattered in every direction. The confusion lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Ethan broke free from the loosened rope wrapped around the pine tree and tackled the nearest outlaw. Their rifles slid across the snow. Clara grabbed the scattered documents before the wind carried them away. Silas recovered quickly and mounted his horse. After them, he galloped toward the old railway bridge spanning a deep frozen canyon. Ethan and Clara followed on horseback while the remaining outlaws raced behind them. The bridge had been built decades earlier. Its wooden beams groaned beneath the pounding hooves. Halfway across, Silas turned and fired. The bullet struck a support beam instead of Ethan. The bridge shook violently. Loose planks splintered beneath the horses. "Ethan!" Clara shouted. "Keep moving," he answered. Silas reached the opposite side first, believing he had escaped. But another sound echoed through the valley. Dozens of riders appeared from the southern trail. Leading them was Reverend Samuel Holt, an elderly minister who had once been Arthur Bennett's closest friend. Beside him rode ranchers from every corner of Pine Hollow. Jacob Turner was among them. Ashamed of his betrayal, he had escaped the outlaws after the avalanche and confessed everything to the townspeople. Instead of protecting Silas, he finally chose to protect the truth. The riders surrounded the bridge from both sides. Silas realized there was nowhere left to run. Desperate, he held the confession above a lantern. "If I burn this," he shouted, "none of you can prove anything." Before he could set on fire, Jacob fired a single shot. The lantern exploded. Silas dropped both the confession and his revolver. Ethan rushed forward and knocked him to the ground. The fight lasted only moments. When it was over, Silas Crow lay handcuffed while the stolen documents rested safely in Clara's hands. For the first time in decades, The truth belonged to the people instead of those who had tried to bury it. Over the following months, judges from the territorial capital reopened every land claim connected to the Crow family. The forged contracts were canceled, and dozens of hard-working families finally received the property that had been stolen from them years before. Arthur Bennett's name was officially cleared. A memorial stone was placed near the town square, honoring the man who had risked everything to defend honest settlers. Clara chose not to return east. Instead, she fulfilled the dream that had first brought her to Montana. With help from the grateful townspeople, she transformed the abandoned church site into a beautiful one-room schoolhouse. Every morning, the sound of children's laughter echoed across Pine Hollow, replacing years of silence. Ethan's ranch changed as well. The lonely house that had once reminded him only of loss slowly became filled with warmth again. Friends visited often, neighbors gathered for evening meals, and hope returned to a place that had long forgotten it. One spring afternoon, Ethan stood beneath a tall pine tree overlooking the valley. Wildflowers covered the fields where snow had once buried every path. He handed the polished brass compass back to Clara. "It never pointed north," he said with a gentle smile. "It pointed toward the life your grandfather wanted you to find." Clara closed the compass carefully. "I thought I came here looking for a job." She looked across the thriving town below. "But I found something far greater." Ethan smiled. "And what was that?" She slipped her hand into his. "A place where truth matters. A place that finally feels like home." As the church bell rang in the distance and children ran across the schoolyard, the people of Pine Hollow knew their town would never again be ruled by fear or lies. They would remember that one courageous teacher, one honorable rancher, and one forgotten promise had changed the future of an entire valley. And for generations to come, whenever someone asked how Pine Hollow found its way back to hope, the answer was always the same. It began on a winter night when a stranger refused to leave another stranger behind.